When Jesus spoke those 3 words on the cross, "It is finished," he wasn't talking about his life ending. He was revealing the greatest spiritual secret ever given to humanity. Most people miss this completely. They think it was a statement of defeat, a final breath, a tragic ending. But Joel Goldsmith discovered what Jesus really meant, and when you understand this, your entire life transforms. What if I told you that every problem you're facing right now, every financial struggle, every health concern, every relationship conflict was already resolved 2,000 years ago? Not in some distant heaven, but in the eternal now of spiritual reality. This isn't religious doctrine. This is mystical truth that changes everything when you truly grasp it. Jesus wasn't saying his mission was complete. He was declaring that the entire human struggle, the illusion of separation from God, the belief in lack and limitation, was finished, done, completed. Not by his death, but by his realization. And that same realization is available to you right now, in this very moment. Here's what Joel Goldsmith taught about these words. In spiritual consciousness, there is no healing to be done because there is no actual disease. There is no supply to demonstrate because infinite abundance already exists. There is no relationship to fix because love is already whole. Everything you think you need to achieve, acquire, or become has already been accomplished in divine reality. The reason your prayers seem unanswered isn't because God isn't listening. It's because you're asking for something that already exists. Imagine standing in a river, dying of thirst, begging God for water. The water is already there. You don't need more water. You need to recognize the water surrounding you. This is what "it is finished" means in practical terms. Most spiritual teaching tells you to work harder, pray longer, visualize better, raise your vibration. But Goldsmith discovered that all spiritual work is actually letting go of the belief that work needs to be done. The finished kingdom is already here. Your job isn't to create it. Your job is to recognize it. This recognition is what transforms everything. Let me show you how this works in daily life. When you face a financial emergency, your natural response is panic, followed by desperate prayer. You ask God to send money, to open doors, to provide miraculously. But if it is finished, then the supply already exists in consciousness. Your work isn't begging or manifesting. Your work is resting in the truth that divine abundance is already established. This doesn't mean sitting passively while bills pile up. It means taking inspired action from a consciousness of completeness rather than lack. When you know it is finished, you move through the world differently. You make phone calls from peace, not desperation. You seek solutions from wisdom, not fear. The external actions may look similar, but the consciousness behind them changes everything. Joel Goldsmith healed thousands of people using this principle. When someone came to him with cancer, he didn't see cancer to heal. He saw the finished spiritual perfection that was always true. His recognition of completeness allowed their consciousness to shift. Not always instantly, sometimes gradually over weeks, but the transformation came from recognizing what was already finished. The technique is deceptively simple, which is why most people miss it. When a problem appears, your first response should be silence. Not prayer for change, but recognition of truth. Sit quietly and acknowledge. In spiritual reality, this is already finished. God's work is complete. What appears as a problem is only my limited perception of something already resolved in divine consciousness. You don't need to feel this truth emotionally at first. You simply need to acknowledge it mentally, repeatedly, until your consciousness shifts. It might take 5 minutes or 5 weeks. The timeline doesn't matter because in spiritual reality, time doesn't exist. What exists is the eternal finished nature of God's creation, which includes you, your body, your relationships, your supply. This isn't positive thinking or affirmation work. This is recognition of what is already spiritually true. When you stop trying to make something happen and start recognizing what has already happened in consciousness, you align with divine reality. That alignment is what we call healing, prosperity, harmony. But these aren't achievements. They're recognitions of the finished kingdom that was always here. Sarah was a single mother facing eviction with 3 children and $72 in her bank account. She had prayed desperately for weeks, cried herself to sleep, applied for every assistance program available. Nothing changed. Then she encountered Joel Goldsmith's teaching on "It is finished," At first, she thought it was cruel spiritual bypass. How could her crisis already be resolved when the eviction notice was real? But something in the teaching resonated. She began practicing recognition instead of petition. Every morning for 2 weeks, she sat in silence, acknowledging that in spiritual reality, her supply was already complete. She didn't feel peaceful immediately. She didn't see money appear. But slowly, her consciousness shifted from panic to quiet certainty. She still took action, still applied for jobs, still made calls. In the 3rd week, a former colleague called about a job she hadn't applied for. The timing was perfect, the salary exactly what she needed. Was this coincidence? Perhaps. But Sarah noticed that the opportunity came only after her consciousness shifted from desperately seeking to quietly knowing. The external provision matched her internal recognition that it was already finished. Marcus struggled with chronic pain for 8 years after a car accident. Multiple surgeries provided temporary relief but never lasting healing. He tried every spiritual technique, positive affirmations, energy healing, meditation retreats. Some things helped briefly, but the pain always returned. When he learned about recognizing completion instead of seeking healing, he felt skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. For 6 weeks, Marcus practiced resting in the truth that in God's reality, his body was already perfect and whole. He didn't deny the pain or pretend it wasn't there. He acknowledged it as a limited perception of something already resolved spiritually. He continued physical therapy and proper medical care, but his inner work shifted from fighting pain to recognizing perfection. The change wasn't dramatic or instant. Around week 7, he realized he'd gone 2 days without thinking about the pain. By week 12, the intensity had decreased by 60%. 6 months later, the chronic pain was gone. His doctors couldn't explain it medically, but Marcus understood. When his consciousness recognized the finished work, his physical experience aligned with that recognition gradually over time. Jennifer and Robert's marriage was ending after 19 years. The resentment was deep, communication had completely broken down, and divorce papers were being prepared. Neither wanted this outcome, but both felt powerless to change the toxic dynamic. A friend gave Jennifer a Joel Goldsmith book about recognizing spiritual wholeness in relationships. She began practicing alone. Every time anger arose toward Robert, she paused and silently recognized, in spiritual truth, love is already complete between us. This isn't wishful thinking. This is recognition of divine reality. She didn't tell Robert what she was doing. She just shifted her own consciousness from seeing a broken marriage to recognizing the finished nature of love itself. Nothing changed for 3 weeks. Then Robert noticed something different about Jennifer, though he couldn't identify what. The atmosphere between them softened slightly. They began having actual conversations instead of arguments. It took 7 months of Jennifer's consistent practice before Robert asked what had changed in her. They didn't have a fairy tale reconciliation, but they rebuilt their marriage on a foundation of recognizing spiritual completeness rather than trying to fix human brokenness. These stories aren't exceptional miracles. They're natural results of aligning consciousness with spiritual truth. Joel Goldsmith worked with thousands of students who experienced similar transformations. Some changes happened quickly, others gradually over months. But the principle remained consistent. When you stop trying to make something happen and start recognizing what is already finished in divine consciousness, your experience shifts. The key difference between this approach and typical manifestation teaching is the foundation. You're not trying to create, attract, or manifest something new. You're recognizing something eternally present. This removes the strain, the desperation, the feeling that you must do more to be worthy of receiving. It is already finished. Your worthiness was established before you were born. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop taking action. It means your actions come from recognition rather than lack, from certainty rather than hope, from knowing rather than seeking. This shift in consciousness is subtle, but profoundly powerful. It's the difference between swimming desperately toward shore and realizing you're already standing on solid ground. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most deeply with your current situation? Now let me give you 3 specific practices that deepen your recognition of the finished kingdom. The first is what Goldsmith called the practice of the presence. This means training yourself to acknowledge God's complete presence in every moment, especially when problems appear. Not God who will help you, but God whose perfect work is already established right where the problem seems to be. When you wake up anxious about your day, pause before getting out of bed. Spend 60 seconds in silent recognition. God's presence is here now, complete and perfect. Whatever this day holds is already resolved in divine consciousness. I'm not entering a day of problems to solve. I'm entering a day of recognizing the finished kingdom. This isn't prayer for help. This is acknowledgement of present spiritual reality. Throughout your day, whenever tension arises, return to this recognition. In a difficult meeting, silently acknowledge, God's perfect harmony is already present here. In a financial crisis, recognize, divine supply is already complete in this situation. You're not creating these realities. You're recognizing them. This practice trains your consciousness to default to spiritual truth rather than material appearance. The second technique is what Goldsmith called resting in the Word. When you read or hear a spiritual truth that resonates deeply, don't just acknowledge it intellectually and move on. Rest in it. Let it saturate your consciousness. If the statement, "It is finished," strikes you as profound, spend time just sitting with those words, not analyzing them, not trying to make them work, just resting in their truth. This is completely different from affirmation work. You're not repeating words to make something happen. You're allowing a spiritual truth to reveal its own meaning to your consciousness. Sometimes this takes 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. Joel Goldsmith would often spend entire sessions just resting in a single statement of truth, letting it unfold its deeper meaning. You might rest in "It is finished" for days or weeks, returning to it again and again. Each time, the meaning deepens. First, you understand it intellectually. Then you begin to feel it emotionally. Eventually, it becomes your consciousness, the lens through which you perceive all of life. This is when transformation becomes natural and consistent rather than occasional and unpredictable. The third practice is recognizing spiritual identity. Most of your problems exist because you identify as a limited human being who needs things, lacks things, struggles with things. But in spiritual reality, your identity is already complete as the expression of divine consciousness. You're not a person trying to reach God. You're God's finished expression, mistakenly believing you're separate and limited. When a health issue arises, your typical response is, "I have a sick body that needs healing." But the recognition of spiritual identity shifts this to, "I am the perfect expression of divine life. What appears as sickness is a misperception of my already established spiritual wholeness." This isn't denial of symptoms. This is recognition of deeper truth underneath appearances. Practice this identity recognition throughout your day. Instead of "I need more money," recognize, "I am the expression of infinite divine supply." Instead of "I need healing," recognize, "I am the manifestation of perfect spiritual wholeness." These aren't affirmations to make something happen. They're recognitions of what is already eternally true in consciousness. Your experience gradually aligns with your recognized identity. These 3 practices work together to deepen your consciousness of completion. The practice of the presence keeps you anchored in spiritual reality moment by moment. Resting in the Word allows spiritual truth to transform your understanding. Recognizing spiritual identity shifts your fundamental sense of who you are from limited human to complete divine expression. Joel Goldsmith emphasized that these aren't techniques to get something you lack. They're practices to recognize what you already are and have in spiritual consciousness. The more you practice, the more natural this recognition becomes. Eventually, you don't have to consciously practice because your default consciousness is recognition of the finished kingdom. This transition takes time for most people. Don't expect instant mastery. Joel himself practiced for years before this consciousness became natural and consistent. But even in the early stages, you'll notice shifts. Problems that once devastated you become minor inconveniences. Lack that once terrified you becomes temporary appearance. The finished kingdom starts revealing itself in your daily experience. Let's address the biggest obstacle most people face with this teaching. When you're in genuine crisis, when the pain is real, when the bank account is actually empty, recognizing it is finished can feel like spiritual bypass. You might think, this is just denial. I'm ignoring reality. I'm pretending problems don't exist. This resistance is completely normal and actually healthy. Here's what Joel Goldsmith taught about this challenge. You're not denying the appearance. You're not pretending the problem doesn't exist on the human level. You're recognizing that beneath the appearance is a spiritual reality that is already complete. Both levels exist simultaneously. The appearance is what you see with human eyes. The reality is what exists in divine consciousness. The mistake most people make is trying to jump directly from seeing the problem to feeling complete peace about it. That's not how consciousness shifts. First, you acknowledge the appearance honestly. Yes, the bank account is empty. Yes, the pain is real. Yes, the relationship is broken. Then, underneath that acknowledgement, you begin recognizing, and yet in spiritual consciousness, this is already resolved. Both truths coexist until consciousness fully shifts. The second major challenge is impatience. You practice recognition for 3 days, and when nothing changes externally, you conclude it doesn't work. This is where most people abandon the teaching right before breakthrough would occur. Joel Goldsmith was very clear about this. Consciousness shift takes time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, occasionally months, for deeply ingrained patterns. Think of it this way. You've spent years, maybe decades, building a consciousness of lack, fear, and limitation. That consciousness didn't form overnight, and it won't dissolve overnight. Every time you practice recognition of completion, you're dissolving old patterns and establishing new consciousness. This is gradual work, like strengthening a muscle or learning a language. The key is consistency without attachment to timeline. Practice recognition not because you expect results tomorrow, but because it's the truth regardless of appearances. Some of Goldsmith's students experienced rapid shifts. Others practiced for months before seeing external changes. But every single person who persisted eventually experienced transformation, because consciousness shift always produces corresponding experience. The third challenge is what Goldsmith called taking back the problem. You practice recognition, feel peaceful, maybe even experience some improvement. Then something triggers the old fear and you immediately forget everything you've learned. You're back in panic mode, desperately praying for help, completely forgetting that it is finished. This cycle frustrates people enormously. Joel taught that this is part of the process, not a sign of failure. Old consciousness patterns don't dissolve linearly. They release in layers. You might have genuine recognition of completion, then face a new trigger that brings back old fear. This doesn't mean you've lost your progress. It means another layer is ready to be released. Each time you return to recognition after forgetting, you deepen the new consciousness. The practice here is gentle persistence without self-judgment. When you catch yourself back in fear and striving, don't condemn yourself. Simply recognize, I forgot. Now I remember. It is finished. The issue isn't how many times you forget. The issue is how consistently you return to recognition. Over time, the periods of remembering grow longer and the periods of forgetting grow shorter. The fourth challenge is spiritual isolation. You practice this teaching and start experiencing shifts, but everyone around you still operates from lack consciousness. Your family thinks you're being irresponsible when you remain calm during crisis. Your friends worry you're in denial. Your logical mind questions if you're delusional. This external pressure can shake your conviction. Goldsmith experienced this himself. When he first began practicing recognition of spiritual completeness, people thought he was avoiding reality. Some called him irresponsible. Others said he was in spiritual bypass. But he persisted because he was experiencing results, even when others couldn't understand his approach. He built a community of practitioners who supported each other in this consciousness. You might need to practice quietly without explaining to others what you're doing. Not everyone is ready to understand that all spiritual work is recognition rather than achievement. Find others who practice this consciousness, even if only through books or online communities. Joel Goldsmith's recordings and writings create a consciousness that supports your practice. You're not alone in this, even when it feels that way. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Let me show you how this works in extremely difficult situations. Michael was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and given 3 months to live. He'd been a devoted spiritual student for years, practiced meditation daily, lived consciously. When the diagnosis came, his first response was feeling betrayed. Why wasn't his spiritual practice protecting him? This is the crisis that tests everything you believe. Michael spent 2 weeks in despair before remembering Goldsmith's teaching on completion. He realized he'd been practicing spirituality as insurance against bad things happening. But "it is finished" meant something different. It meant that even in this diagnosis, spiritual perfection was already present. Not that the cancer wasn't real, but that underneath the appearance was unshakable divine wholeness. He began practicing recognition of spiritual completeness while still receiving medical treatment. He wasn't choosing between medicine and spirit. He was recognizing spiritual truth while taking practical human action. For 8 weeks, nothing changed externally. The cancer progressed as predicted. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. His pain decreased. His energy returned slightly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Michael's story didn't end with instant miraculous healing. It unfolded over 18 months of consistent recognition practice combined with medical care. The cancer went into remission, returned partially, then finally disappeared completely. His doctors called it unexplained spontaneous remission, but Michael understood. His consciousness had shifted from seeing himself as a person with cancer to recognizing his spiritual identity as the perfect expression of divine life. What's most remarkable isn't that the cancer disappeared. It's how Michael lived during those 18 months. He experienced profound peace even when scan results were discouraging. He maintained deep certainty even when symptoms worsened temporarily. His family and friends witnessed someone facing death with inexplicable calm. This peace wasn't denial or resignation. It was the natural result of consciousness anchored in completion. Joel Goldsmith taught that healing isn't really about fixing bodies. It's about consciousness recognizing its own spiritual nature. When that recognition is genuine and sustained, physical healing often follows, but not always instantly and not always in expected ways. The real healing is freedom from fear, which is possible regardless of physical circumstances. Michael discovered this truth through his most difficult trial. Rebecca's business was failing catastrophically. She'd invested everything and was facing bankruptcy that would destroy her financially for years. She'd built this company with pure intention, wanting to serve people and create something meaningful. The failure felt like cosmic punishment. How could she have been so wrong? This is where spiritual teaching meets brutal practical reality. She discovered Goldsmith's work through a friend during her darkest week. The teaching on "it is finished" initially angered her. How dare someone suggest her crisis was already resolved when she was losing everything? But desperation makes you willing to try anything. She began practicing recognition, not because she believed it, but because she had no other options left. For the first month, nothing external changed. The business continued declining. But something subtle shifted internally. Rebecca found herself making clearer decisions from calm rather than panic. She negotiated better terms with creditors. She identified which parts of the business to save and which to release. The ultimate outcome wasn't what she originally wanted. The business did close, but she preserved enough to start fresh without complete devastation. What Rebecca discovered through this process transformed her understanding of completion. "It is finished" didn't mean her business would be saved as she wanted. It meant that in divine consciousness, her true purpose and supply were already established. The business closing was actually part of recognizing completion, not a failure of the principle. Sometimes completion looks like endings, so new beginnings can emerge. 2 years later, Rebecca built a different business aligned more authentically with her gifts. She credits the first business failure as necessary for discovering her true work. But more importantly, she learned that recognizing completion doesn't mean controlling outcomes. It means trusting that whatever unfolds is part of divine perfection, even when it doesn't match your human preferences. This is advanced understanding of Goldsmith's teaching. Completion doesn't mean getting what you want. It means recognizing that divine wisdom is already at work in your life, including through apparent failures and disappointments. When you truly rest in "it is finished," you develop the capacity to see perfection even in unwanted circumstances. This is genuine spiritual maturity, not beginner's magical thinking about manifesting desires. After months or years of practicing recognition of completion, something profound shifts in your consciousness. You stop dividing life into problems and solutions. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs fixing. You start experiencing life as the continual unfolding of something already complete. This isn't a belief you hold, it's the consciousness you live from. Everything changes from this foundation. You still face challenges, but they don't devastate you. You still experience loss, but it doesn't destroy you. You still encounter difficult people and situations, but they don't control your inner state. Why? Because your identity is no longer tied to circumstances. You know yourself as the finished expression of divine consciousness, and that knowing remains stable regardless of what happens externally. Joel Goldsmith lived from this consciousness for decades. People who knew him described a quality of peace that wasn't dependent on anything, not because his life was perfect or problem-free, but because his consciousness was anchored in spiritual completion. This is available to you, not as a distant goal, but as a present reality you're learning to recognize more consistently. The practical transformation shows up in unexpected ways. You notice you're not obsessively checking your bank balance anymore, not because you suddenly have unlimited wealth, but because your consciousness isn't attached to the numbers. You find yourself in difficult conversations without the old defensive reactions. Not because you've learned better communication skills, but because you're not protecting a vulnerable, limited self anymore. Your health becomes more stable. You sleep better. You feel more energy. Not because you're doing special wellness practices, but because anxiety isn't depleting your system constantly. Your relationships improve, even difficult ones. Not because people change, but because you're no longer approaching relationships from need and incompleteness. You have nothing to get from others when you know you're already complete. These changes happen gradually, almost imperceptibly. One day you realize you haven't worried about money in weeks. Another day you notice chronic pain that plagued you for years has quietly disappeared. You find yourself laughing more easily, feeling lighter, experiencing spontaneous joy. These aren't achievements you worked for. They're natural expressions of consciousness recognizing its own completion. Here's what most spiritual teachings won't tell you. Even after years of practice, you'll still have moments of forgetting. You'll still face situations that trigger old fear patterns. You'll still catch yourself striving and seeking instead of recognizing. But these moments become less frequent and less intense. More importantly, you recover faster. You don't spend days or weeks lost in fear before remembering truth. This is the realistic picture of spiritual transformation, not perfection, but progress. Not constant bliss, but increasing peace. Not immunity to challenge, but capacity to remain centered through challenge. Joel Goldsmith never claimed to be beyond human experience. He simply developed the consciousness to recognize spiritual completion more consistently than most people. You're developing the same consciousness. Every time you practice recognition instead of petition, every time you rest in completion instead of striving for achievement, every time you identify as spiritual wholeness instead of limited human, you're building this consciousness. It becomes your natural state gradually, through consistent practice over time. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he was speaking to you across 2,000 years. He was telling you that the spiritual work is already complete. You don't need to become worthy, achieve enlightenment, or earn God's love. You already are the finished expression of divine perfection. Your only work is recognizing this truth consistently enough that your human experience aligns with spiritual reality. This recognition transforms everything, not because it changes external circumstances, though it often does, but because it changes you. You become someone who lives from completion instead of lack, from certainty instead of fear, from knowing instead of seeking. This is the greatest transformation possible in human consciousness. Joel Goldsmith spent his life helping people discover this truth, not as distant spiritual theory, but as practical daily reality. The same transformation he experienced and facilitated in thousands of others is available to you right now. Not tomorrow, not after more spiritual work, but now. Because it is finished. It always has been. You're simply learning to recognize what was always true. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. Most people hear Jesus say, "My burden is light," and think he's offering comfort for their heavy struggles. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something revolutionary that changes everything. Jesus wasn't talking about making your problems easier to carry. He was revealing that when you live from Christ consciousness, there is no burden at all. The weight you feel isn't real, it's the false sense of separation from God. What if every heavy burden you're carrying right now is just a mistaken belief? Joel taught that the moment you recognize your true identity as spiritual consciousness, the entire structure of human struggle collapses. Not gradually, not eventually, but in the instant of clear recognition. This isn't positive thinking or mental tricks. It's the fundamental shift that Jesus himself demonstrated. Here's what actually happens in that shift. You stop trying to fix, heal, change, or improve anything in the material realm. Instead, you rest in the awareness that God's presence is already complete, already perfect, already whole. The burden vanishes because you see there never was a real burden to begin with. Only a dream of separation that seemed real until you woke up. Joel Goldsmith spent decades teaching students this precise recognition technique. He called it the practice of impersonalization, where you stop giving power to appearances and rest in spiritual truth. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light," he was describing the actual experience of living from this consciousness. Not the experience of a better human life, but the recognition that human struggle itself is illusion. Think about what Jesus meant by yoke. A yoke connects two oxen to share the work of pulling a heavy load. But Jesus is saying his yoke is easy because in Christ consciousness, there's no work to do at all. You're not pulling anything. You're not carrying anything. You're simply being the presence of God that you already are, have always been, and cannot stop being. This is where most spiritual seekers make their fatal mistake. They try to use consciousness techniques to improve their human experience, to manifest better circumstances, to heal their bodies. But Joel taught that the real transformation happens when you stop trying to change anything and simply recognize what's already eternally true. That recognition itself is the entire teaching. Let me show you exactly how this works in practical terms. When a problem appears in your experience, whether it's financial pressure, relationship conflict, or physical pain, your first instinct is to fix it, pray about it, or try to change it. But that approach keeps you trapped in the illusion that the problem is real and has power. Joel's technique is radically different and infinitely more effective. Instead of addressing the problem, you turn within to recognize spiritual truth. You don't deny the appearance, but you refuse to give it the power of your belief. You silently acknowledge that God's presence knows nothing of this problem, that in consciousness there is no lack, no conflict, no disease. Not because you're creating a better reality, but because you're recognizing the only reality that exists. This is what makes the burden light. You're no longer trying to carry it, heal it, or solve it. You're seeing through it to the truth that was always there. Joel called this the revelation of oneness, the recognition that nothing exists but God and God's perfect expression. When you really see that, when you really know that, the burden simply isn't there anymore because it never was. Here's the part that challenges everything you've been taught about prayer and spirituality. Joel discovered that Jesus wasn't teaching a method to get God to help you with your burdens. He was revealing that in your true identity as Christ consciousness, burdens cannot exist. The light burden isn't a lighter version of human struggle. It's the complete absence of struggle when you stop believing in separation. Most people spend their entire spiritual journey trying to become more conscious, more awakened, more enlightened. But Joel taught that you cannot become what you already are. You are already the full presence of God. You are already complete spiritual consciousness. The only thing standing between you and that recognition is your belief in the reality of material appearances and human problems. When you truly understand this teaching, something shifts in your entire being. You stop fighting, stop struggling, stop trying to improve your human self, not because you've given up, but because you've woken up to the truth that there is no human self to improve. There is only God being itself as your individual consciousness. That's why the burden is light. It literally disappears in the light of truth. Let me share what happened to Robert, a successful attorney who came to Joel's teachings after years of crushing anxiety. Robert had everything the world defines as success: a prestigious career, financial security, a loving family. But he carried a constant weight of worry about losing it all, about not being enough, about the next crisis waiting around the corner. He tried therapy, medication, meditation apps. Nothing touched the core burden. When Robert first heard Joel explain that his burden wasn't real, he felt angry. Of course it was real. He could feel it in his chest every morning. But Joel's teaching kept working on him. He started practicing the recognition technique, not to feel better, but to see the truth. For 3 weeks, nothing changed. Then one morning, sitting quietly before work, something shifted completely. Robert suddenly saw that the anxiety he'd been carrying for decades had no actual source. There was no real threat, no actual problem, only his belief in separation from God's presence. In that moment of clear seeing, the burden simply vanished. Not because his circumstances changed, but because he recognized they had never had the power he'd given them. He described it as waking from a nightmare and realizing none of it was ever real. Here's what makes this different from every other spiritual teaching you've encountered. Joel wasn't offering a technique to manage your burdens better or reduce their weight. He was showing you how to see through the entire illusion of burden itself. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Not rest from your problems, but rest in the recognition that problems have no reality in God. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly try to improve your life, heal your body, fix your relationships, increase your abundance. That exhaustion comes from believing that you're a limited human being who needs to become something more. But Joel taught that you're already the infinite presence of God, already complete, already whole. The burden of self-improvement vanishes when you stop trying to improve what doesn't actually exist. This is why Jesus could say, "My burden is light," while facing crucifixion. He wasn't pretending the experience wasn't difficult. He was living from a consciousness that knew his true identity couldn't be touched by any human experience. The same consciousness is your true identity right now. Not something you need to achieve or develop, but something you need to recognize and rest in. Linda, a nurse working in intensive care, discovered this truth in the most challenging circumstances. She watched suffering every day, felt the weight of families in crisis, carried home the grief of patients who didn't survive. Traditional spiritual practices told her to protect her energy, create boundaries, practice self-care. But the burden kept growing heavier, no matter what she did to manage it. Then Linda began studying Joel's teaching on impersonalization. She learned to look at each situation, no matter how tragic it appeared, and recognize that God's presence was the only reality. Not to deny the human experience, but to see beyond it to the spiritual truth that couldn't be touched by disease or death. This practice transformed her entire experience of nursing without changing a single external circumstance. Within 2 months, Linda noticed she no longer carried the weight home. Not because she cared less, but because she'd stopped giving reality to the appearances of suffering. She could be fully present with patients and families while resting in the recognition that their true spiritual identity was untouched and perfect. The burden became light because she saw it had no foundation in truth, only in the belief that matter and material circumstances were real and powerful. What Joel discovered is that Jesus wasn't speaking metaphorically when he said, "My burden is light." He was describing the actual experience of consciousness that knows its true identity. In that consciousness, there is no heavy burden to carry, because there is no separated self to carry it. There is only God being itself as infinite individual expression, and God knows nothing of burden, struggle, or effort. This is the secret that changes everything. You're not trying to lighten your burdens through spiritual practice. You're recognizing that in your true nature as consciousness itself, burdens cannot exist. They appear to exist only when you believe you're a limited material being separate from God. The instant you recognize your actual spiritual identity, the entire structure of burden collapses like a dream, vanishes when you wake. Joel spent 40 years teaching students this one truth in countless different ways. The burden is light not because God helps you carry it, but because the recognition of God as your only reality dissolves every burden instantly. This isn't theory or philosophy, it's the practical mysticism that Jesus lived and Joel Goldsmith taught with absolute clarity. If this revelation about Jesus' true meaning speaks to your heart, like this video to share these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment which burden you're ready to see through to the truth beneath it. Now that you understand the foundation, Joel taught 3 specific practices that help you live from this consciousness throughout your day. The first is what he called the practice of pausing. Whenever you feel the weight of a burden beginning to form in your awareness, you pause completely. Not to think about the problem or pray about it, but to remember that you're not a human being trying to reach God. You're God consciousness itself having a human experience. In that pause, you don't try to change anything or fix anything. You simply rest in the recognition that whatever appears as a burden has no reality in consciousness. Joel would say, see it, don't be it. You see the appearance without becoming identified with it as your problem. This takes practice because your conditioning is to immediately engage with problems as if they're real and you need to solve them. But as you practice pausing and resting in spiritual identity, something remarkable happens. The burdens that used to dominate your thoughts and drain your energy begin to lose their grip. Not because they go away, but because you're no longer feeding them with the belief that they're real. Joel called this starving the problem of your attention and belief, while nourishing the truth of spiritual wholeness. The second technique Joel taught is recognizing the nothingness of appearance. This sounds abstract until you actually practice it and experience its power. When a burden appears, whether it's a frightening diagnosis, a financial crisis, or a relationship breakdown, you look directly at it and recognize that it has no cause, no law supporting it, and no reality in God. Therefore, it's nothing trying to appear as something. Joel was very specific about this practice. You're not denying that the appearance exists in the material realm. You're recognizing that it has no spiritual substance, no actual power, no reality in consciousness. It's like recognizing that the monster in your nightmare can't hurt you, because it has no existence outside the dream. The moment you see its nothingness, its power over you dissolves completely. Christopher, a financial advisor, used this technique during the market crash that threatened his entire career. Instead of panicking or trying to control outcomes, he practiced seeing the financial crisis as having no reality in God's consciousness. Within 3 weeks, opportunities began appearing that he would have missed in his usual state of anxious problem-solving. The burden lifted not because circumstances improved, but because he stopped giving reality to the appearance of crisis. The third practice Joel emphasized is what he called living by grace. This means recognizing that you don't have to make anything happen, fix anything, or become anything. Grace is the activity of God consciousness being itself as your experience without any effort from you. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy," he was describing the experience of letting grace live your life instead of trying to live it yourself. Most people struggle with this because they've been conditioned to believe that they must take action, make things happen, control outcomes. But Joel taught that this belief in personal responsibility and personal power is actually what creates the burden. When you recognize that God consciousness is the only power and presence, you relax into allowing that consciousness to express itself as your perfect experience. This doesn't mean you become passive or inactive. It means your actions flow from consciousness rather than from fear, need, or the belief that you must make things happen. Jessica, a small business owner, discovered this when she stopped striving to grow her company and instead rested in recognizing God as her supply. Within 6 months, her business doubled, not because she worked harder, but because she stopped working from burden and started allowing grace to unfold naturally. Here's how these 3 practices work together to keep the burden light in your daily experience. You pause to remember your spiritual identity. You recognize the nothingness of whatever appears as a burden, and you rest in grace, allowing consciousness to live itself as your experience. This isn't a formula you follow to get results. It's a way of being that naturally emerges when you stop believing you're a limited human self. Joel taught that the more you practice these recognitions, the more they become your natural state of consciousness. You stop alternating between spiritual awareness and human struggle. You begin to live from a consistent recognition that you are consciousness itself, that burdens have no reality, and that grace is always operating as your experience whether you see it or not. What makes the burden light is that you're no longer carrying it. You've recognized that the self you thought was carrying burdens doesn't actually exist. There is only God consciousness being itself as your individual awareness. From that recognition, everything becomes effortless because you're not trying to be or do anything. You're simply being what you already are and always have been. Let's be honest about the challenges you'll face when you start practicing this consciousness. The biggest obstacle is that your entire conditioning screams at you that the burden is real, that you must do something about it, that ignoring it will make things worse. Every part of your trained human response fights against simply resting in spiritual recognition and doing nothing to fix the problem. Daniel experienced this intensely when he tried to apply Joel's teaching to his failing marriage. His wife had moved out. Divorce seemed inevitable, and everyone told him he needed to fight for the relationship. But Joel's teaching said to recognize that in God, there is no separation, no relationship to fix, only perfect spiritual union. For weeks, Daniel felt like he was doing nothing while his marriage collapsed. What Daniel discovered is that doing nothing humanly doesn't mean nothing is happening spiritually. As he practiced recognizing the spiritual perfection beneath the appearance of separation, something shifted in his consciousness. He stopped being desperate, stopped trying to control outcomes, stopped believing the appearance of marriage breakdown was the truth. After 2 months of this practice, his wife called wanting to talk, and they began a completely new relationship based on consciousness rather than need. Another challenge is what Joel called the temptation to return to human solutions. You practice the recognition for a while, see some results, then when a new burden appears, you immediately forget everything and go back to trying to fix it humanly. This is completely normal and happens to everyone who practices this consciousness. The key is catching yourself and returning to recognition without judgment. Amanda faced this repeatedly during her journey with chronic pain. She would practice seeing through the appearance of disease to spiritual wholeness, feel relief. Then the moment pain returned, she'd panic and go back to desperate searches for medical solutions. Joel taught that this back and forth is part of the process. You're not failing, you're learning to trust consciousness more than appearance. What finally shifted for Amanda was realizing that even her inability to maintain the recognition consistently was just another appearance to see through. She stopped judging herself for forgetting and simply returned to truth each time she remembered. Over 6 months, the periods of clear recognition grew longer, the pain's grip weakened, and eventually she found herself living from consciousness naturally, without having to constantly remind herself. The third major challenge is isolation from people who don't understand this consciousness. When you stop complaining about your burdens, stop seeking sympathy, stop trying to fix everything, people think something's wrong with you. They may accuse you of being in denial, of not facing reality, of abandoning your responsibilities. This can create intense pressure to return to normal human struggle. Kenneth, a corporate executive, faced this when he stopped participating in the constant complaining and problem-solving that dominated his workplace culture. Colleagues thought he'd become cold or checked out. His boss worried he'd lost his edge. But Kenneth was actually more effective than ever because he was working from consciousness rather than from stress and burden. He just looked different to people still living from human struggle. Joel warned that this path can be lonely at times. You're living from a consciousness that most people don't recognize or understand. But he also taught that the peace and freedom you experience are worth any external misunderstanding. Kenneth eventually found that his consistent, peaceful presence began attracting others who sensed something different about him, and small conversations about consciousness began opening naturally. Here's the challenge that stops most people completely. There will be times when you practice recognition perfectly, maintain consciousness beautifully, and the burden not only doesn't lift but seems to get heavier. This is when most people conclude that Joel's teaching doesn't work and return to traditional spiritual methods or give up entirely. But Joel taught that this experience is actually a crucial part of the transformation. What's happening in those moments is that your recognition is bringing to the surface deeper layers of belief in material reality that need to be seen and released. The apparent worsening isn't a sign that consciousness isn't working. It's evidence that consciousness is working so powerfully that everything unlike itself is being exposed to be recognized as nothing. This is the refining fire that Jesus spoke about. Rebecca went through 3 months where practicing recognition seemed to make her financial situation worse instead of better. Every time she recognized God as her infinite supply, a new unexpected expense appeared. Joel's teaching helped her understand that these appearances were the last gasp of her deep belief in limitation being brought to light. She persisted in recognition, and suddenly everything shifted. Within 2 weeks, solutions appeared that resolved not just the current crisis, but patterns that had plagued her for years. If these challenge-breaking insights resonate with your experience, like to support this transformational content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith practices, and comment which obstacle you're ready to see through to the spiritual truth beneath. Let me show you how this consciousness works in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. William was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and given months to live. His family begged him to try every possible treatment. His doctors presented aggressive protocols. But William had been studying Joel Goldsmith for years and decided to rest completely in the recognition that disease has no reality in God consciousness. This wasn't denial, and it wasn't refusing medical care irresponsibly. William chose to work with doctors, but from a consciousness that knew the diagnosis had no spiritual reality. Every symptom, every test result, every prognosis he met with the same recognition. God knows nothing of this, therefore it has no actual existence, no real power, no truth. For 6 months, his physical condition didn't change at all. Then something remarkable happened. William said it wasn't that he was healed, but that he recognized he'd never been sick in spiritual reality. The cancer remained visible on scans, but he was living in such peace and freedom that his quality of life amazed everyone. After 8 months, the cancer began shrinking. After 14 months, it was gone. But William insisted the real transformation happened the day he stopped believing disease was real, not the day the diagnosis changed. Here's what Joel taught about these advanced demonstrations of consciousness. The healing isn't about changing material conditions. It's about seeing so clearly into spiritual reality that material appearances lose their power to define your experience. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "I have overcome the world." Not changed the world. Overcome it by recognizing it has no power in consciousness. Elizabeth applied this understanding to a business that was collapsing spectacularly. Partners had stolen from her. Debts were crushing. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Traditional spiritual advice said to visualize success, affirm abundance, take inspired action. But Joel's teaching went deeper. Elizabeth practiced recognizing that in God consciousness, there is no business to fail, no partners to betray, no debt to crush. Only infinite spiritual substance expressing perfectly. For 4 months, circumstances kept deteriorating while Elizabeth maintained recognition. Her attorney thought she was crazy for being so peaceful, facing financial ruin. But Elizabeth had discovered what Joel meant by the burden being light. She wasn't carrying the business collapse, wasn't carrying the betrayal, wasn't carrying the financial pressure. She was resting in consciousness while letting appearances run their course. When the breakthrough came, it came suddenly and completely, with opportunities that not only restored, but multiplied what appeared to have been lost. The most advanced practice Joel taught is maintaining consciousness in the face of other people's suffering. This is where most spiritual students fail, because their compassion pulls them into believing the appearance is real. You see someone in pain and want desperately to help, to fix, to heal. But Joel taught that the greatest help you can give anyone is to not believe in their burden, to see through the appearance to their perfect spiritual reality. Richard, a chaplain in a children's hospital, struggled terribly with this. How could he look at sick children and not believe in their suffering? How could he practice Joel's teaching without becoming cold and uncaring? What he discovered transformed not only his ministry, but the actual outcomes for families he served. When he stopped believing in the reality of childhood disease and instead recognized each child's perfect spiritual identity, something shifted in the atmosphere. Parents reported feeling unexpected peace in Richard's presence. Doctors noticed that families he counseled seemed to handle crisis better. And over time, Richard witnessed several cases where children recovered in ways that defied medical explanation. Not because he prayed for healing, but because his consistent recognition of spiritual perfection created an atmosphere where truth could be seen more clearly. This is the advanced consciousness that Joel taught, where your recognition serves everyone without trying to help anyone. Here's the ultimate challenge of living this consciousness. You'll reach a point where you see clearly that there is no personal you to live this consciousness. The one who's been practicing recognition, maintaining awareness, seeing through appearances, that one doesn't exist either. There is only consciousness being itself, appearing as what seems to be your individual experience. This recognition can be terrifying because it dissolves everything you thought you were. Nicole went through what Joel called the dark night of the soul when she recognized that not only were her burdens illusory, but the self she thought was overcoming, those burdens was equally illusory. For 3 weeks she felt completely lost, neither here nor there, unable to return to human consciousness, but not yet stable in spiritual recognition. Joel taught that this dissolution of personal identity is actually the gateway to true freedom. What emerged for Nicole was a consciousness that no longer alternated between burden and freedom, between human and spiritual, between problem and solution. There was simply consciousness being itself without any sense of a separate Nicole trying to maintain anything. From that recognition, life became genuinely effortless, not because circumstances were always pleasant, but because there was no one there to be burdened by circumstances. This is what Jesus demonstrated and what Joel spent his life teaching others to recognize in themselves. Now you understand why Jesus said, "My burden is light." He wasn't offering comfort for your human struggles. He was revealing that in Christ consciousness, in the recognition of your true spiritual identity, burdens cannot exist, not because they become easier to carry, but because the one who seemed to be carrying them is recognized as illusory. There is only God consciousness being itself as infinite individual expression. This is the complete transformation that Joel Goldsmith devoted his life to teaching. Not a better human life, not improved circumstances, not even healing of body or finances, though those often occur. The transformation is from believing you're a limited material being separate from God to recognizing you are consciousness itself, whole, complete, and perfect right now. Not becoming perfect, already perfect, always have been perfect, cannot be anything but perfect. When you live from this recognition, everything changes while nothing changes. Circumstances may improve or may not. Your body may heal or may not. Your relationships may transform or may not. But you are free regardless because you've recognized that your true being is untouched by any human experience whatsoever. The burden is light because there is no burden. There never was a burden. There's only consciousness being itself perfectly. Let me show you what this looks like in actual daily living. You wake up in the morning, and instead of immediately thinking about your problems, your responsibilities, your burdens, you pause and recognize you are consciousness waking to itself. The person who seemed to sleep, who has problems to solve and burdens to carry, is just an appearance in consciousness like a character in a dream. Your true identity is the consciousness itself, the awareness in which everything appears. Throughout your day, challenges arise, decisions need to be made, responsibilities must be handled. But you're meeting everything from consciousness rather than from a separate self trying to manage life. You're not trying to lighten your burdens. You're recognizing that burdens have no reality in what you actually are. This isn't denial of human experience. It's seeing through human experience to the spiritual truth that underlies it. Brian describes living this way as being in the world, but not of it. Exactly what Jesus taught. He goes to work, handles problems, interacts with people, fulfills responsibilities, but he's no longer identified with any of it. He's consciousness watching itself appear as Brian's life, while knowing that nothing in that appearance has the power to be a burden, because nothing in it is ultimately real. The burden is light because it has no weight in consciousness itself. Here's what happens over time as you stabilize in this consciousness. You stop seeking spiritual experiences because you recognize you are the spiritual presence itself. You stop trying to improve yourself because you see there's no separate self to improve. You stop wanting circumstances to change because you know that consciousness is complete, regardless of what appears to be happening in form. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop caring. It means you act from wholeness rather than from need, from consciousness rather than from fear, from grace rather than from effort. Joel called this living by grace, and it's the most natural, effortless way to live because you're no longer fighting against reality or trying to change it. You're simply being what you already are, while letting consciousness live itself as your experience. Angela says the greatest freedom came when she realized she didn't have to maintain this consciousness, couldn't lose it, and had never actually been without it. The struggle to be conscious was itself the last burden to release. When she saw that consciousness is what she is, not what she has or maintains, everything became simple. The burden wasn't just light, it was completely absent because there was no separate one there to carry anything. This is the secret Jesus was teaching when he said, "Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He was saying recognize your true identity as Christ consciousness, and every burden disappears in that recognition. Not because circumstances change, though they often do, but because you see clearly that burdens exist only in the belief that you're something other than consciousness itself. Joel Goldsmith spent 40 years making this teaching practical and accessible. He showed thousands of students how to move from intellectual understanding to actual recognition, from concept to consciousness, from belief to being. His gift was making mystical truth so clear and practical that anyone willing to practice can experience the same freedom that Jesus demonstrated and that Joel lived. You now have everything you need to let the burden become light in your experience, not by trying to lighten it, but by seeing through it to the truth of what you are. Consciousness itself, whole, complete, perfect, free, and utterly unburdened by any appearance whatsoever. This is your true nature, always has been, always will be, and nothing can change or diminish it. The burden is light because in truth, there is no burden at all. If your understanding of Jesus' teaching has been completely transformed by these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to help others discover this freedom, subscribe for more consciousness awakening content, and comment, "My burden is light," to confirm your recognition of this spiritual truth. Most people hear Jesus say the kingdom is within you and nod politely, then immediately return to seeking answers outside themselves. They pray to a distant God somewhere in the heavens. They beg for intervention from above. They wait for external circumstances to shift before they can experience peace, health, or abundance in their lives. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something that changes everything about how you approach spirituality and life itself. When Jesus said the kingdom is within, he was not speaking poetically or using beautiful metaphors to inspire followers. He was revealing the most practical, powerful spiritual law in existence that governs all of reality. This is not philosophy for intellectual discussion. This is the actual mechanics of how reality operates at the deepest consciousness level. The kingdom within is not a future destination or a reward for good behavior after years of spiritual practice. It is the present, living, active presence of God already established in your consciousness right now. Everything you have been desperately seeking outside yourself, every solution you have been chasing in the external world, has always been within you, complete and perfect, waiting not to be created or developed or earned, but simply to be recognized and realized through spiritual awareness and understanding. Here is what Joel taught that most spiritual teachers completely miss in their approach to transformation. The kingdom within is not something you build slowly over time, or develop through decades of practice, or earn through good deeds and perfect behavior. It is already complete, already perfect, already fully functioning in your consciousness. Your only work, your single responsibility in this spiritual journey, is to stop seeking the kingdom elsewhere and turn your attention inward to what already exists in fullness. This shift in focus is the entire transformation. You are not trying to become something new. You are recognizing what has always been true. When you understand this deeply in your bones, something fundamental shifts in your entire being and approach to life. You stop the exhausting search for solutions in the external world of people, circumstances, and conditions. You stop begging, pleading, and desperately manipulating circumstances to achieve what you think you need for happiness. Instead, you begin to live from the kingdom within as your foundation and source. You make decisions from that inner knowing rather than external pressure. You respond to challenges from that inner peace rather than reactive fear. You create from that inner abundance rather than desperate lack. Joel Goldsmith spent decades proving this principle through thousands of documented healing experiences around the world. He watched terminal illnesses dissolve when people stopped seeking healing from outside sources like doctors, practitioners, or techniques, and recognized the perfect kingdom of health already established within their consciousness. He observed profound financial transformations when individuals ceased the frantic pursuit of supply from external channels, jobs, and opportunities, and rested in the understanding that infinite abundance flows continuously from the kingdom within their own being. The outer circumstances then rearrange themselves naturally to reflect this inner realization. Relationships healed dramatically when people stopped trying to change, fix, or control others, and instead dwelt consistently in the kingdom of love and wholeness within themselves. Careers flourished when individuals operated from their inner guidance rather than following external pressure, expectations, and conventional pathways that felt wrong. Every single area of life transformed from the inside out when people made this shift. Not through effort, struggle, or manipulation of external conditions, but through simple recognition of what was already true in the invisible realm of consciousness, where all reality originates and finds its source. The reason this principle is so revolutionary and life-changing is because it reverses everything you have been taught about how life actually works. You were taught to analyze problems carefully, strategize complex solutions, and take massive external action to force changes. Society conditions you to believe transformation requires external effort. Joel reveals that true transformation happens when you first recognize the perfect kingdom within your consciousness, and then watch as external reality naturally conforms to that inner recognition without force. The outer world is always reflecting your inner consciousness. Change consciousness, and the outer world must follow. This does not mean you become passive, lazy, or stop taking action in the physical world. It means your actions flow from inner wisdom and guidance, rather than from fear, lack, or desperation. You move through life guided by the still, small voice within, rather than being tossed around by external opinions. When you truly understand why Jesus emphasized the kingdom within, you stop living as a beggar, seeking crumbs from the external world. You live as royalty who knows the infinite kingdom is your permanent inner reality, and everything you genuinely need flows naturally from that inexhaustible source within your own consciousness. Let me share what happened to a woman named Margaret who had been battling chronic debilitating pain for 7 long years. She had tried every medical treatment available, every alternative therapy, every healing modality that offered hope. Nothing provided lasting relief. She was physically and emotionally exhausted from the endless search. When she encountered Joel's teaching about the kingdom within, something clicked deep in her understanding. She stopped seeking healing from doctors, practitioners, techniques, or external sources entirely. Instead, she spent time each day quietly recognizing the perfect kingdom of health already established in her consciousness as spiritual truth, not hoping for healing to come someday, not visualizing or affirming future health, but simply acknowledging what was already true in the realm of consciousness. She recognized that perfect health existed in the kingdom within, regardless of what her physical body was currently experiencing or what symptoms were manifesting. Within 3 weeks, the pain began to diminish noticeably. Within 2 months, it was completely gone and never returned. But here is what matters most in this story. Margaret did not attribute her healing to a miracle from outside herself. She understood that she had simply stopped blocking the perfect health that was always present. Then there was David, a businessman facing complete bankruptcy after years of building his company. His business was drowning in overwhelming debt. Creditors were circling aggressively. Every external strategy had failed miserably. He was desperate, terrified, and could not sleep at night worrying about losing everything he had worked to build. Traditional business thinking said he needed to work harder, find new investors quickly, or drastically cut costs to have any chance of survival. He was following all the conventional advice but sinking deeper. The external approach was not working no matter how much effort he applied to solving the problems. Joel's principle turned his entire approach completely around in a radical way. David began each morning sitting in the recognition that infinite supply flows continuously from the kingdom within his own consciousness. He stopped the frantic external scrambling and desperate attempts to force solutions. He made business decisions from inner guidance rather than panic, Over the next 6 months, unexpected opportunities appeared from directions he never considered. New partnerships formed naturally. Income streams emerged that he had not even imagined existed. His business not only survived the crisis, but thrived beyond his previous success. David learned that when you live from the kingdom within, the external world reorganizes itself. Another powerful example was Rachel, whose marriage was collapsing after 15 years together. Years of professional counseling had not helped improve the relationship. She and her husband were emotionally distant, resentful, constantly arguing over small things. She was convinced that he needed to change, that if only he would listen and improve, their relationship could heal. All her efforts and energy focused on trying to fix him, make him understand, change his behavior. She read books about communication, tried new approaches to get through to him, but nothing worked. The harder she tried to change him, the worse the relationship became. She was exhausted and ready to give up. When Rachel discovered the principle of the kingdom within, she stopped trying to change her husband entirely. This felt counterintuitive at first. Instead, she dwelt consistently in the kingdom of love and wholeness within her own consciousness. She recognized that the perfect relationship already existed in the spiritual realm as truth. Remarkably, within weeks, her husband began to soften naturally without Rachel saying a word about change. The distance between them dissolved gradually. Communication improved organically. Rachel learned that when you live from the kingdom within, you stop trying to manipulate external circumstances and instead allow your inner realization to transform everything around you without force. These stories reveal the consistent pattern Joel Goldsmith discovered through decades of intensive spiritual practice and healing work with thousands of people. When you genuinely understand that the kingdom is within, you stop the exhausting battle with external conditions. You cease begging for change from outside sources that have no real power. This is not overnight magic or instant miracles that happen without any process. Most people experience gradual transformation over weeks and months as they deepen their understanding and consistently apply this principle. There are moments of doubt, frustrating setbacks, and challenging periods. This is the realistic path of spiritual growth and development. But those who persist in recognizing the kingdom within, who return to this truth daily despite appearances, consistently report that their entire life begins to reorganize from the inside out. The shift happens not through willpower or positive thinking techniques, but through genuine realization of what is already true in consciousness. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore this teaching further, like this video to help others discover these life-changing principles, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom and practical techniques, and comment what healing journey resonated most deeply with your own experience and spiritual path. Now let me give you a practical technique Joel taught for consciously accessing the kingdom within every single day. This is not complicated or requiring years of training, but it does require sincerity and consistency in application. Begin each day with 15 to 20 minutes of inner silence before the demands of daily life consume your attention. This is not meditation in the traditional sense of emptying your mind or achieving special states. It is a conscious recognition of the divine presence already established within you right now. Sit comfortably and acknowledge that the kingdom of God is within your consciousness at this very moment, not tomorrow, not after you become more spiritual. Recognize that infinite wisdom, unconditional love, perfect health, and unlimited abundance are already present in this inner kingdom as established spiritual truth. Your work is not to create them through effort or earn them through good behavior, but simply to recognize what already exists in fullness within your own consciousness. As thoughts about problems, fears, worries, or needs arise during this quiet time, gently return your attention to the kingdom within. Do not fight the thoughts or feel guilty for having them. Simply acknowledge that the solution to every perceived problem already exists in the perfect kingdom of your consciousness waiting to be recognized. Joel taught another powerful practice he called resting in the Word throughout your entire day. As you move through daily activities, when challenges arise or difficult situations present themselves, pause briefly and internally acknowledge a spiritual truth, not as a magic formula to manipulate reality, but as recognition of what is already true. For example, if fear suddenly arises about a situation, You might silently recognize that perfect love already exists in the kingdom within, and perfect love casts out all fear. If financial lack appears threatening, you recognize that infinite abundance flows continuously from the inexhaustible source within your consciousness, regardless of external bank balances. If illness threatens your peace or physical symptoms appear concerning, you acknowledge the perfect health already established in consciousness as spiritual truth. This is not denying the external appearance or pretending problems do not exist. It is recognizing a deeper reality that exists beyond physical appearances in the realm of consciousness. You are training your attention to rest in the kingdom within rather than being hypnotized by external conditions that constantly change. Over time, with consistent practice, this approach becomes automatic and natural. You naturally live from inner recognition, rather than outer reaction to whatever circumstances present themselves in daily life. A third technique Joel emphasized was what he called listening for the still, small voice within. The kingdom within is not silent, passive, or inactive. It is constantly communicating guidance, wisdom, and clear direction for every situation you face. But most people are too busy with mental noise and external distractions to hear it. Create intentional spaces in your day specifically for inner listening without agenda or demands. This might be 5 quiet minutes between activities, a contemplative moment before important decisions, or regular periods of contemplative silence where you simply listen. In these moments, ask your inner guidance for direction on specific situations. Then actually listen, without filling the silence with your own thoughts, ideas, or plans. Not listening for dramatic voices or mystical visions, but for gentle knowing that arises naturally. The guidance from the kingdom within often comes as a subtle sense of knowing, a feeling of rightness about a particular direction, quiet certainty about which path to take. Learn to trust this inner voice over external opinions, logical analysis that misses spiritual truth, or fearful thoughts that create worst-case scenarios. As you follow this guidance consistently over time, you discover it leads you perfectly through every situation, even when the path does not make logical sense to your rational mind. Joel also taught the essential practice of living fully in the now moment as your permanent state of awareness. The kingdom within exists only in the present moment. It is not in memories of the past or worries about the future. When your attention scatters across time, you lose contact with the kingdom that is always here, always now. Bring your full attention to whatever you are doing in this exact moment without mental division. Whether working, eating, walking, or talking with someone, be completely present rather than mentally rehearsing the past or planning the future. This present moment awareness is the doorway to experiencing the kingdom within consistently. The divine presence is here now in this moment, not in some future moment when conditions improve or problems resolve. Waiting for better circumstances before you can experience the kingdom within is missing the entire point. The kingdom is available right now, regardless of what is happening externally in your life circumstances. This practice transforms ordinary activities into sacred experiences infused with meaning. You discover that the kingdom within enriches every moment with depth, peace, and fullness when you are truly present. You stop postponing your life, waiting for better circumstances to finally arrive. You recognize that fullness of life is available now through the kingdom within. But let me be completely honest about the real challenges you will face when applying this principle consistently. The biggest obstacle that stops most people is doubt that arises when external circumstances seem overwhelming. You will have moments when problems seem so massive that the idea of an inner kingdom feels like fantasy or denial of reality. This doubt is completely normal and happens to everyone on this path, even advanced practitioners. When doubt arises, do not fight it, resist it, or feel guilty about experiencing it. Simply acknowledge the doubt without giving it power. Then gently return your attention to the recognition of the kingdom within as your foundation and truth. Doubt is just a thought passing through consciousness, like clouds passing through sky. It has no actual power to diminish the reality of the inner kingdom. The kingdom exists whether you doubt it or believe it, whether you feel it or not. Your doubt does not change spiritual truth, only your experience of it. Another significant challenge is impatience with the process of transformation. You want immediate results, instant dramatic transformation like the stories you hear. But genuine realization usually deepens gradually over time through consistent practice. Some people experience rapid shifts, others notice subtle changes over weeks and months of dedicated application. You will also face the challenge of deeply ingrained old mental habits that have been programmed since childhood. You have spent years, perhaps decades of your life, looking outside yourself for solutions to every problem. These external seeking patterns are deeply ingrained in your consciousness and nervous system through repetition. You will catch yourself automatically returning to the old way of external seeking, manipulation of circumstances, and exhausting struggle to force changes. This happens to everyone initially. The old patterns are like well-worn paths that your mind follows automatically without conscious thought. Breaking these patterns requires awareness and gentle persistence. When you notice this happening during your day, be genuinely gentle with yourself rather than self-critical. Awareness itself is the first essential step to lasting change. Simply acknowledge that you slipped into old patterns of external seeking, then consciously redirect your attention to the kingdom within as your true source and foundation. Each time you do this redirecting, you strengthen the new pattern and weaken the old one. Gradually over time, living from the inner kingdom becomes your natural default state rather than something you have to remember to do. Some days will feel easy and clear. Other days will feel difficult and confusing. This is natural rhythm. Another significant challenge is resistance from people around you who do not understand this principle. When you stop participating in collective worry, fear, and external seeking that everyone engages in, others may feel uncomfortable with your different approach. They may accuse you of being unrealistic, irresponsible, or in denial about serious problems. Family members might criticize you for not worrying enough about situations they think deserve anxiety. Coworkers might judge your calm presence during crises as lack of appropriate concern. Friends might think you have joined a cult or lost touch with reality. This social pressure can shake your commitment to living from the kingdom within. Stand firm in your understanding without needing to convince others or defend your approach. You are not responsible for making people understand this principle or approve of your spiritual path. Your only responsibility is to live from the kingdom within yourself and allow your transformed life to be your testimony. As your life transforms over time through this practice, some people will become curious and ask genuine questions about what changed in you. Others will continue to disagree and criticize your approach. Both responses are completely fine. Remember that Jesus faced the same resistance when he taught this radical principle to his followers. The final challenge I want to address directly is the subtle temptation to use this principle as a technique for getting what you want. The ego is clever and will try to turn the kingdom within into a tool for manifesting desires, controlling outcomes, and improving your personal situation to satisfy wants. This ego approach misses the entire point of the teaching. The kingdom within is not a means to an end or a technique for manifestation. It is the end itself, the fullness you have been seeking. When you genuinely recognize and live from the kingdom within, you discover that what you thought you desperately wanted often dissolves. You realize you already have everything you genuinely need in consciousness. The desperate seeking stops naturally because you feel complete in yourself. This does not mean your external life stays exactly the same or nothing improves. In fact, your life often improves dramatically in ways you could not have planned or imagined. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak deeply to your heart and resonate with your spiritual journey, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices and weekly teachings, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform right now in your life? Now let me show you specifically how to apply the kingdom within principle to different life situations you face. When facing a health challenge or physical symptoms, the old conventional approach is to focus intensely on the symptoms, research treatments obsessively, and fight the disease with all your energy and attention. This keeps your attention concentrated on the problem, which actually reinforces its reality in your consciousness. Where attention goes, energy flows. Focusing on illness strengthens the experience of illness in your consciousness. This is not to blame yourself for being sick, but to understand the mechanics of how consciousness operates in creating experience. The kingdom within approach is radically different in every way. You acknowledge the symptoms honestly without denying their current appearance, but without giving them ultimate power or reality. Then you turn your attention away from symptoms to the perfect health already established in the kingdom of your consciousness as spiritual truth. You recognize that in spiritual truth beyond physical appearances, you are whole, complete, and functioning perfectly right now. This does not mean you reject medical care or ignore practical wisdom. It means you do not give the illness ultimate reality or final word. You treat it as temporary appearance that has no power to diminish your true nature. When dealing with financial pressure or money concerns, most people become consumed with worry, frantically seeking new income sources and feeling trapped by scarcity consciousness. Every thought revolves around lack, what is missing, bills that cannot be paid. This mental state focused on lack actually blocks abundance from flowing. The constant focus on what you do not have creates more experience of not having. Consciousness is always demonstrating itself in outer form. If consciousness is dominated by lack, the outer experience will be lack. This is the law of consciousness that cannot be broken, only understood and worked with consciously. The kingdom within approach transforms everything about your relationship with money and supply. You recognize that infinite supply is flowing from the inexhaustible source within your consciousness right now, in this moment. Not in the future after you find the right job or opportunity, but now as present reality in consciousness. Abundance is the very nature of the kingdom within, regardless of external bank balances or current financial circumstances. From this recognition as your foundation, you make financial decisions from inner guidance, rather than from fear or desperation. You may take the same practical actions, but your internal state is completely different and attracts different results. In relationships, the kingdom within principle stops you from demanding that others change to meet your needs and expectations. Most relationship problems stem from believing that your happiness, peace, and fulfillment depend on someone else behaving differently than they currently behave. This creates exhausting cycles for everyone involved. When you make others responsible for your inner state, you give away all your power. You become a victim of their choices, moods, and behaviors. No one can consistently make you happy from outside yourself. This is impossible and unfair to expect. Yet this is what most people do unconsciously in their relationships. When you live from the kingdom within, you recognize that love, peace, and fulfillment already exist in your consciousness, independent of anyone else's behavior. You stop making others responsible for your inner state or happiness. This does not mean you tolerate abuse or stay in unhealthy situations that harm you. It means you are complete within yourself first, and then you relate to others from that inner fullness rather than from neediness and lack. From this completeness, your relationships transform naturally without force. You attract people who resonate with your inner state. Existing relationships either improve dramatically or gracefully end to make room for what matches your consciousness. For career and life purpose, most people look externally for validation, success markers, and approval from others to feel worthwhile. They measure their value by titles, income levels, and recognition from peers or society. This creates constant anxiety because external measures are always shifting and never provide lasting satisfaction. There is always someone more successful, someone earning more, someone with a better title or more recognition. The external comparison game is unwinnable and exhausting. You sacrifice your authentic path trying to meet external expectations and definitions of success that may not fit your unique purpose. The kingdom within approach grounds your work in inner guidance rather than external validation or social approval. You ask the still small voice within what you are genuinely meant to contribute with your unique gifts. You follow the inner knowing even when it does not make logical sense or match conventional success measures. People who operate from this foundation often find themselves in unexpected careers that deeply fulfill them at soul level. Their work becomes an expression of the kingdom within, rather than a desperate attempt to prove their worth or secure their survival. Success comes naturally as byproduct of living authentically from inner truth. As you deepen your understanding of the kingdom within over time, something remarkable happens to your entire perception of life. You stop dividing life artificially into spiritual moments and ordinary moments. You recognize that every single activity, every conversation, every decision is an opportunity to live from the kingdom within your consciousness. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on the divine presence within. Business meetings become opportunities to listen for inner guidance about decisions and directions. Difficult conversations become moments to rest in the peace that exists permanently in the kingdom of your consciousness, regardless of external conflict or tension. There is no separation between sacred and secular activities, because everything is infused with the divine presence when you are aware. Driving your car, preparing meals, working at your desk, all become sacred when done from recognition of the kingdom within. This is living the mystical life that Joel taught as the ultimate goal, not withdrawing from the world into monasteries or ashrams, but moving through the world while remaining constantly rooted in the kingdom within as your foundation. You engage fully with practical responsibilities and daily life while never losing touch with the inner source. This balance transforms both your inner experience and outer effectiveness in the world. At this advanced stage of practice, you also develop what Joel called spiritual discernment or inner knowing. You can feel immediately when you have slipped into external seeking versus living from the kingdom within. There is a distinct, recognizable difference in the quality of your inner state that becomes obvious with experience. External seeking feels tense, effortful, anxious, like swimming upstream against current. Living from within feels peaceful, flowing naturally, guided by something beyond your personal effort. Your body itself can feel the difference. Tension versus ease, struggle versus flow, contraction versus expansion in your energy. This discernment allows you to course correct quickly in any moment. The instant you notice tension or struggle arising, you recognize you have forgotten the kingdom within and return to external seeking. You pause wherever you are, acknowledge the perfect presence already established in your consciousness, and return to that foundation. This becomes an automatic inner adjustment that keeps you aligned throughout your day. You also develop the ability to recognize when others are speaking from their own inner kingdom versus when they are lost in external appearances and surface-level thinking. This helps you know whose guidance to receive and whose opinions to gracefully ignore without judgment. The ultimate realization of the kingdom within is what Joel called dying daily to the human sense of self or separate identity. This sounds dramatic and frightening, but it simply means releasing the limited, small identity that believes it is separate from God, that must fight for survival, that depends on external circumstances for fulfillment. As this limited false self dies through recognition of truth, your true identity as the kingdom of God in expression is gradually revealed. You discover you are not a separate person seeking connection to the divine source. You are the divine presence individualized, the kingdom of God made manifest in unique human form. This is your true nature that has always existed, but was hidden by false identification with the limited human sense of self. This realization does not make you arrogant or separate from others. Instead, you recognize the same spiritual truth in every person you meet, whether they are aware of it yet or not. Everyone is the kingdom of God, individualized and expressing uniquely, whether they know this truth or not. Your work is to see this truth consistently in yourself and others, regardless of external appearances or behaviors that seem to contradict this spiritual reality. This vision itself helps awaken others to their true nature. So here is what actually happens when you truly understand why Jesus said the kingdom is within you. Your entire life reorganizes around this central truth as your foundation. You stop the exhausting, endless search for fulfillment, healing, abundance, and love in the external world where it can never be permanently found. You recognize that everything you have been desperately seeking is already present in consciousness, waiting only to be recognized and lived from. This is not the end of challenges or difficulties in daily life. Life continues with its natural ups and downs, changes and uncertainties. But your fundamental relationship to life is completely transformed. You are no longer at the mercy of circumstances or controlled by external conditions. You are rooted in the unshakable kingdom within, and from that solid foundation, you move through whatever life brings with peace, wisdom, and power that does not depend on anything external to yourself. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets and practical teachings, like this video now, subscribe for more transformative spiritual content weekly, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your commitment to this new path of living from the kingdom within.